always tell people that I remember the day that I fell in love with Pitt, because it was when I came here for orientation prior to school starting, and I got here late, and the program had already started. So everybody was in their program, and the campus was kind of a little dead. It was in August. And my dad dropped me off in the quad, and he had to go to work. He was a steel mill worker also, and he was working 4 to 12 that day, so he had to leave. And he just like literally took, and he was my dad was wonderful, but he just like took my suitcases out of the trunk of the car and kissed me goodbye and left, because it was he had to go to work, and I really didn't know where to go. As I said, I never visited campus before, so I was like just standing in the quad, like looking around and thinking to myself, oh my gosh, this is where I'm going to be for the next 4 years. Look at this place, I mean, really, being coming from Menneson, Pennsylvania, a small town, being in the middle of that quad and seeing these buildings. And my mom had told me that when she was in nursing school at Mercy Hospital, she had gone to a big ball at the Shenley Hotel, and I just looked around and I just thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be my place here for the next 4 years. And I was just like sold from the first second that I arrived here. So I grabbed my little green Samsonite suitcase and found my way to the Towers lobby to get registered, and that was that.
Pitt was a gateway for so many of us to have a bigger and better and very different life than what we grew up with. And when I think of some of the buildings I saw for the first time, having class in this classroom, having a history class in this classroom, and going to Heinz Chapel for various services, for Lantern Night as a freshman, and being in the quad and living in Amos Hall, and all of these spaces were much bigger than anything I had ever knew about in those years as a child growing up in a steel town. Probably the biggest space I had ever really been in and sort of was accultured to was my church. But to come to, it was just so much bigger than me, and it was exciting for those reasons.
I remember the sit-ins and the big afros and what were those shirts called? The tie-dye shirts, and protests, and this is great, because it just wasn't part of my family to do such things. And then we had the tradition of Lantern Night, so it was a great mix. There was so much to do. I had a great time. In nursing, we didn't have our own building, which we do now. We're very thankful for. We had women and children and birthing of babies at McGee, and we went up to SCAE for Med-Surg and Western Psych for Psych Mental Health, so it was a lot of running around, but it was interesting. And as far as the campus, I think it's very much the same as my friends have talked about, but I think that the ranking and the image of the university is grown, and we're just so proud to be a Pitt graduate, and that's the feeling I have when I first came here and continued on to where we're at today.
There's a lot that is the same though. I mean, the cathedral's still here, Benedum is still here where I took most of my classes, Amos is still there, Tower B's still here where I grew up and lived. But two places that aren't here anymore was my fraternity house, we were up on Belfield, and Pitt Stadium, and miss both places terribly. My fraternity house is now up on top of the hill. It's just not quite the same as the old houses that existed back in the 70s. I don't know how we survived. And for me, I really miss Pitt Stadium. It was where I spent, other than in class, most of my days and weekends and summers while I was here. So.
He had to bring up Pitt Stadium, which is still tugs at my heartstrings all the time, because we had 2 generations go through there. My husband was an athletic trainer, and later that room was converted to the band room, and our daughter was in band, which is where she met her husband. But we spent a lot of time in Pitt Stadium, had a lot of memories of that, and I actually had to do a painting after it was taken down to kind of, so I can get over it. I did all my favorite parts of Pitt Stadium, so I have that hanging in our house because that's just sentimental to us.
Pitt football dominated the scene here for everyone, even if, like me, I wasn't into football. I didn't have a football team from my high school, so I didn't really know much about football so much. But it dominated because we were national champions in the 70s. And so that whole play up to the year, I remember the day that Michigan lost and Pitt was named #1 in the country, and we were up at Pitt Stadium, and the place, it was a radiant day like today, navy blue skies, beautiful sun, and it was homecoming, and the entire stadium erupted. When they announced that Michigan had lost and Pitt was #1, the stadium went crazy. And then we were national champions that year, and it was very, very exciting. It was really fun.
While I was an undergraduate was when Title IX passed, and it's actually pretty interesting. I wouldn't say that I was exactly a pest, but I did know the athletic director at the time pretty well, Kaz Myslinski, because I made the trip to his office frequently to talk about women's sports and those kind of things. And so when I graduated in 1974, the university moved the women's athletics program from the physical education department to the athletics department. And the jobs were all open, and I had done a lot of coaching at that point in time, so I was admitted to the Graduate School of Public Health, and I was looking for a way to pay for grad school, so I applied for the job. I was 22. And Kaz Myslinski called me in my dorm room on the 22nd floor of Tower B for my interview. And fortunately, I'd done student teaching the semester before, and I actually had one blazer and one pair of slacks. So I went up to my interview and I got the job, and that's kind of how I got started at Pitt. And credit to Kaz Myslinski for hiring someone who was a little bit of a pain in the neck to him during her undergraduate years, but somehow he saw fit to get me started there.
I lived in Amos Hall, which was the sorority hall, and it was wonderful. There were big living rooms on both sides and kitchens, as Susan was saying, and we had beautiful big rooms, and it was a wonderful experience to live in Amos Hall. Centrally located right in the quad. The day I graduated, I sat out in the quad and bawled my eyes out with my friends. To leave Amos Hall was unthinkable to me.
Well, I remember standing on the roof watching the streakers. That was the time of streakers, and that was
We're gonna
great
talk about that.
fun.
I remember taking women's, it was very cutting edge to have women's classes that talked about women's literature. Learning about the Shulamith Firestone and all these different feminist authors. And my brother, who's older than me, had written to me and said, "You're in school at an interesting time. You need to pay attention to what's happening with women's rights." And the university started to fashion itself and its curriculum around that. And I was taking classes that I would never have thought as in high school that I'd be taking here. But it was clear that things were changing for women in a very big way. Women were starting to be more in leadership on campus. Women in my sorority, many were choosing options that were not necessarily typical women's options, and many of us went on to business school and other kinds of things that weren't commonplace at that time, really. When I went to business school, it was a very small percentage of the graduate class that were women.
I wanted to make sure I graduated when my husband did, since I was a year younger, so I went spring semester, and so I just went straight through. And I decided one semester I had to take probably 2 or 3 extra courses in a normal course load, and I had to go to the dean to get that approved. And he said, "Since you're a girl, I'm not going to allow you to do that." And I said, "I really appreciate if you would sign this paper, because I'm going to do it anyway." So I did do it, and I did fine. It wasn't easy, but that's my only thing I can remember about being challenged.
The thing I remember was because we were still in the lottery. I still had a number, even though we didn't get drafted. But there were a few guys in my fraternity that had come back, and they were older and scared the hell out of us. And that's my most vivid memories of some of those guys who had actually been in combat and coming back to a place like this and having to really gear down a lot, but boy did they scare us. But that's my very clear memory back then.
I remember the sit-in on the chancellor's, in front of the chancellor's office, and I could not believe that we were going to do something so irreverent. I was in a traditional role as a nurse, but the Pitt nurses were educated to be a colleague and not a handmaiden. And so that was a new view. When the older physicians would come in and they would expect us to get up out of our chair, and we'd look up at them and say, "I'm sorry, may I help you?" Not getting my chair, vacating my chair because that's just what they expected to do for no other reason. So that too was a trailblazer, and
Yes.
I was very proud to be a Pitt nurse because we had so many different experiences in different hospitals. It wasn't just one, and so we were acclimated to a lot of different types of physicians, including residents.
Mine was the national championship, and actually the Sugar Bowl, because it was like the culmination of all the work behind the scenes that really an average fan doesn't get to see. You have your coaching staff, you have how hard the players work, you have your medical staff, you have all the managers, it's a cooperative type of thing. That truly is teamwork, and it's a special chemistry that it's just, for a championship, I think it's just a chemistry thing also. And to be able to observe all of these people as they built up to this championship, and just how it all unfolded, and then to actually be in New Orleans, and I just remember I was down close to the field. I jumped the fence and asked the security guard if I could go back afterwards and hang out in the tunnel where the players would come through before they got to the locker room, and he said, go ahead, and I did, and it was just, I just had to see what it was be like. I obviously couldn't go in the locker room, but I just wanted to see and just watch the reactions of all these people that I've interacted with for so long. It was really a special thing.
Well, I was there. I mean, that was a special moment. But to be candid, and I think Michelle even touched on it, there were so many different things that we were exposed to for the first time, or that were so unique. That was certainly one thing, and coming from a small school and being around that. But I also got to tell you, I met my wife here too as an undergrad, and for me that was probably the most special moment.
My husband and I say we were engaged at the time. We went to the same high school, but that was really the start of our life together, and we're still doing all this stuff. We have 3 generations now, and almost 6 grandchildren, excuse me. So it's so much fun.
Yeah.
It's great, so we went through all that together.
Well, I remember Lantern Night, and that tradition was so fascinating that we would become Pitt women. And at the time, there wasn't a corollary for men. Since then, there are some things. But as the flame bearers, the women and alums who would come back and light the lanterns, and there was always a very inspirational, motivational speaker that night. Well, ironically, when my daughter was an undergrad at Pitt, all these thousands of women in Heinz Chapel were getting their lanterns lit, and I get chills when I think about this. My daughter Jill walked up to me, and I got to light her lantern. It just happenstance. It just occurred, and so that's a memory that I have a picture of in my office, and something that we'll never forget.
Graduation from the Graduate School of Public Health, which was in the auditorium of that building, which the auditorium doesn't exist anymore because they're renovating it. But I can remember my mother and my wife being there. My father had died several years before, but having my mother come up from Buffalo at the time to see me graduate. I still remember that very well.
We got married at Heinz Chapel, and many years later, or not that many years later after that, but that was pretty cool. I know other people have done it, alums have done that. It was cool. It was neat being there in that place. Beautiful building in its own right, but extra special since we both met there and graduated from there. So that was really cool.
It was a really surprising thing to me that someone who was one of your professors would actually take an interest in you personally and actually give you advice on what you should do about graduate school, or what you should do as far as your job is concerned, or even who you should marry. I even had one of those conversations with Dr. Carl Peterson up in Trees Hall. He closed his office door, and we had a little chat about that because he thought I needed a little help there, and I did. And he was on the same page as my dad, so that was a good thing. But I think that when I think about my undergraduate days, I think of the people that I was close to at that time and how much they meant to me in my life.